Hello everyone, thank you for coming all the way to New Jersey, and thank you for being here and joining us in this panel. With our speakers, it's been organized by Union Elrowmeim, that Somia is the founder for, and the C Corp and Action Corps at NYC. And we welcome you here and thank you for taking the time to talk about this very important issue. I'm going to give a brief introduction about the panel, kind of what we're going to be talking about, and then introduce each speaker. They're going to give about 2 minutes introduction about what they do and what are the main things that got them to get interested in the Yemeni humanitarian crisis and what's happening in the Middle East in general. So, as you all know, in 2019, the war in Yemen enters its 4th year. The war is the result of the Saudi-Emirati military alliance and the decision to wage a war of attrition that left tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and in a calamity and millions of displaced persons. In addition, the war led to the spread of disease and poverty, affecting 83% of the Yemeni people. The whole world is watching and has been watching, but no action has been taken, or at least any effective action has been taken, and the Yemeni people are caught between the pressure of the Saudi-Emirati alliance, on one hand, the famine, the disease, the war zone, and the Western silence and Arab collusion on the other hand. The war in Yemen is a war in every sense of the word, and horrendous in every sense of the word, against the human being in all components of the country. We have here a diverse panel where we have Americans who have been covering the war in Yemen, not since it started, but the entire the country and the entire situation that led to this conflict. We have activists that have been trying to give voices to the Yemeni people and Yemeni-Americans to kind of like introduce this conversation with everyone here, with the government, with different parts of nonprofits and international community. And we have a Yemeni person who's been born there, has been in the US, who is in constant contact with the Yemeni people and feels it every day, not just by being Yemeni, but also by seeing her family member in there. So I'm going to let every single person introduce himself. We're going to start with Larry Goldbetter. Did I pronounce it right?
Yep. Hi, I'm Larry Goldbetter. I'm president of the National Writers Union. We're an affiliate of the International Federation of Journalists, which represents about 600,000 media workers in 180 unions and associations in about 140 countries, including 12 unions in the Middle East and the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate. We've been active on international solidarity and with the Arab-American Association of New York, with the Arab-American Family Center, we organized a forum on Yemen a year ago, and with the same group and with the Action Corps, we took part in demonstrations when the Crown Prince was making his victory lap of the U.S. and signing billions of dollars of contracts. And so we're here to offer whatever support and solidarity we can.
Right. Good afternoon, Salam. It's an honor to be here with you all today. And I want to thank Inside Arabia. You see the flyers on your chairs for having sponsored the minivans that brought folks here from Brooklyn. And I want to thank all of you for being here, for taking the time out of your day. And some of you have traveled very far from other continents to be here with us today, and others who are here from across the river. And thank you for being here. I know there's some of the folks who are here who English is their second language, and so thank you for listening in your second or maybe your third language. And it's good to be here with you in New Jersey and to build relationships across state lines. People in New Jersey have been playing a critical role in stopping this war. I'm part of Action Corps, NYC. I started this group 11 years ago as part of Oxfam America, the Humanitarian relief organization. And 3 years ago, we became independent. We're part of a network called Action Corps around the United States. And our concern is championing justice with and for people who are most affected by violent conflict and climate disasters. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for coming out. My name is Ben Norton. I'm a journalist, and I have been reporting on the U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen, and I'll point out later why it's a U.S.-Saudi war, not just a Saudi war, on Yemen since it began in March 2015. At the time, I was reporting a lot on the war when very few journalists were covering it, when Obama was president, and then when Trump became president, suddenly people began reporting on it more. But I was reporting on it for Salon, and I now run an investigative journalism website with a colleague of mine called The Gray Zone. That is thegrayzone.com. And thanks for inviting us. And this is an important panel, so I'm glad we're having this discussion. Thanks a lot.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Somia Elrowmeim. I am the Union for Arab Women founder, and also I work for American Association of New York as the Adult Education and Women Empowerment Program Manager. And also, I have done so much work to advocate for my country and people around America and too that affect Yemenis people. I'm so happy to be part of this event.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming all the way to New Jersey. Thank you for... Alright, so we are covering 4 different topics during the discussion, and as much as 4 topics is very little to talk about something this impactful and this big and this complicated, we'll try to have a flow of discussion and stay out within the themes, and then hopefully when we have more time later we can take questions and kind of have follow up with all of the speakers. So I encourage you to take notes if you need anything if there's any specific information, data, or question that you want to have, make sure to take it down, and then we can go back to it in the discussion at the end. The first discussion or theme that we want to talk about is kind of the background to the war in Yemen will be the latest human rights reports on condition in Yemen. And I'm going to start out with having Ben Norton, who has been covering, as he said, the war before the conflicts and also throughout the conflicts and a lot more than the recent coverage from the U.S. Kind of give a brief description of the conflict to introduce the latest reports and kind of like an explanation about how it started out.
This should work. Thank you, Sonia. Testing. So before I get to the statistics, because it's easy to get overwhelmed by numbers, let's just have an overview of the conflict, because frequently, as with U.S. media reports on Palestine and other conflicts, they're frequently biased in the interest of the government and its allies like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and against Palestine. And as we've seen in the reporting on Israel-Palestine, where the media almost always is just completely biased in the favor of Israel, many of the media reports, until recently, were extremely biased in the favor of Saudi Arabia and its allies, the UAE, and of course the US and the UK. So looking back at the beginning of the war, this March 26th, was the 4th anniversary of the Saudi bombing in Yemen. Of course, there has been a conflict in Yemen for longer than that. Something that is endemic and indigenous to Yemen. It is something that has been unleashed upon Yemen by multiple external agents, and our government, as Americans, has played a key role in this from the very beginning. And I also must stress this is a bipartisan war. So the war began when Saudi Arabia began bombing on March 26, 2015, and of course Obama was president then, a Democrat, and it has continued under Trump. And in response to that, we have also seen appropriately a bipartisan campaign from both Democrats and Republicans, mostly progressive Democrats who are leading the campaign in Congress against the war. So we need to understand that this is not something that began with Trump. This is something that has been going on for years now. Obama oversaw the first 2 years of the war, and Secretary of State John Kerry. Now, as for the actual crisis itself, we're going to talk later on about the objectives of the war in Yemen, the political reasons. And this is an intensely political conflict. It's not just a humanitarian crisis. It's one that's been created for political reasons. but in terms of understanding the extreme human suffering that we as Americans and simply as people, as humans, need to understand, because the US government is, again, extremely complicit in selling weapons, planes, and other forms of assistance to Saudi Arabia. From the very beginning, the US has been providing intelligence, has been selling billions of dollars of weapons. There have even been American and British military officials involved in the war, in the Saudi command center. So you actually have American military officials who are advising the Saudi Royal Air Force in its bombing campaign. Ostensibly, the US military says that they're providing intelligence to Saudi Arabia to help them target military targets, but as I'll discuss in a second, even if that is true, there is a huge amount of evidence showing that the Saudi bombing has intentionally been targeting civilian infrastructure. And I'll go through the statistics in a moment. The reporting on this has been very bad, even from the United Nations. There have been very few people from international aid organizations and the UN on the ground in Yemen. And of course there have been a lot of Yemeni journalists, some of whom have been killed and wounded in the conflict, in the bombing and in the fighting. And they, of course, have done a good job. But in terms of international reporting, it's been quite lousy. And we have to rely on a few independent sources, especially one of the greatest groups reporting on the war in Yemen has been the Yemen Data Project. This is a group of experts, some in Yemen, some outside of Yemen, academics, journalists, and such, who have been working with folks on the ground to document the effects of the bombing. And this is not always included in media reports, but they're the best source. They're completely independent. They're not affiliated with any government. And they have been documenting the airstrikes and have documented nearly 20,000 air raids. And these are coalition air raids that are carried out by Saudi Arabia in alliance with the US, UK, and the United Arab Emirates. So nearly 20,000 air raids over 1,500 days. They have documented at least 8,000 civilian deaths and more than 9,000 civilians injured. Now, that is a very conservative estimate. These are just what they have documented. The actual death toll is significantly higher, and there have been scholars who have suggested that the violent death toll from the actual bombing and the other forms of warfare, but the bombing is responsible for around 2/3 of civilian casualties. There's also fighting on the ground and shelling by both sides, and that certainly has killed civilians. But simply because inside Yemen in the war, the North government does not have an air force they're using to bomb. So simply the side with the air force is responsible for the vast majority of civilian casualties, which is the southern government, which is led ostensibly by the president Hadi, but Hadi has been actually living in Saudi Arabia since the beginning of the war. He fled when the Saudi bombing began. He has been staying in Riyadh, and he actually just visited this past week Yemen for the first time since August. So ostensibly the southern government, supposedly, but it's actually largely just a Saudi puppet regime. They, of course, both sides are responsible, but they're responsible for the majority of the casualties. So looking at this toll that is exacted on the country, the Yemen Data Project has documented nearly 2,000 attacks on residential areas. So that would be civilian homes. They have documented 640 bombings, air raids on farms. And this is an important detail because there is a lot of evidence. The scholar Martha Mundy has documented from London School of Economics that the Saudi coalition is actually intentionally targeting food infrastructure in Yemen. I'll show you in a second. There has been documented attacks on more than 24 hospitals. There's been documented attacks on dozens of schools. I mean, I go down the list. So we need to understand that this is not just a military conflict. This is actually an all-out war on the population. And Saudi Arabia is bombing these civilian areas with weapons that were provided from the US military. There have been numerous instances in which actual shrapnel and debris from the bombing has been found in civilian sites. Buses full of school children have been bombed, and the rubble of the bombing shows pieces of the bombs that say "Made in USA," "Made in Britain." So, I mean, I could go on for a very long time. I don't want to keep rambling, but we need to understand that. Well, one other final comment. I mentioned that So there have been these groups documenting the violent deaths. And the actual toll of the violent deaths is probably between 60 to 80,000 people killed. That includes both non-military and military, so civilians and soldiers. But those are just the violent deaths. The last note I'll make here, which is extremely important, is that even when the death toll is acknowledged, frequently what is not acknowledged is the death toll from non-violent causes, which in this war has been the vast majority of deaths. In fact, there have been well over 100,000 Yemeni children, those are just the children, who have died from preventable causes because of the war. So I mentioned that hunger is a huge problem, with 20 million Yemenis who are food insecure, 10 million on the verge of famine. Of those people, in just the year 2016, 63,000 Yemeni children died from preventable causes, according to UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund. That is 1 year. Save the Children documented in 2017, another 50,000 children died from preventable causes, largely malnutrition and disease. So that means that in just those 2 years, 2016 and 2017, more than 100,000 Yemeni children, just the children, died from preventable causes. So just in terms, I mean, these numbers can be overwhelming, and I'll end here because we could go on for a very long time.
And we can talk about it when we have the different kind of...
we need to understand again that this is the worst crisis on the planet, and it always needs to be what's
we'll talk about the different agents and how different countries and different alliances have led to that. But for now, I want to give the mic to Larry to kind of like talk about the many particularities and of the war in Yemen, kind of like give a big picture to try to understand, from both sides, from the U.S. perspective and also from the start of the war.
Okay, well, we took a cab over here from the New Jersey transit station, and we happened to have a Palestinian driver who asked us what was going on and what we were doing. We told him, and he said, well, if you get rid of all the outsiders, the Saudis, the U.S., Iran, there is no more war. So I told him, well, that's basically what I'm going to say. So I think, first of all of this this war and all of the tragic consequences of it are taking place under the racist travel ban against Muslims that Trump imposed and was ratified by the U.S. Supreme Court. And it takes place in an atmosphere of really a tremendous amount of anti-Muslim hysteria that's gone on and has been building since 2001, since 9/11. And you can see now the attacks on Congresswoman Omar are nonstop, and leading up to the recent massacre in New Zealand at 2 mosques. So this is how this kind of a thing gets justified, or they attempt to justify it. And really, while there's a lot of particularities to the war, and certainly Ben and I'm sure Somia and Isaac have a lot more to offer on the particularities than I could. To me, I think that if you pull the camera back a little bit, I see the 2 million displaced Yemenis as part of a bigger picture, as part of the same phenomena that has created 11 million refugees in Syria, more than 1 million in Afghanistan, more than 3.5 million in nearby Somalia, and more than 65 million refugees worldwide that are fleeing from war, terror, and poverty. And there's particularities to every situation, but what really helps me to understand it more is to see this as more of a global phenomenon. And what is that phenomenon? To me, I think the main aspect of it is the decline of U.S. imperialism and its weakening grip on what it used to have as its empire, and maybe imperialism in general. But to fill that vacuum, regional players are acting more in what they see as their own interests without asking permission. And certainly Saudi Arabia and Israel are two that are the top of the list. And Israel could be a whole other discussion. But I think that there's a guy, Jeffrey Feltman, who's former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and the UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs and Foreign Affairs, that the road to peace runs through Riyadh. And not only would it stop the bloodshed in Yemen, it could slow or stop the slide in Saudi Arabia's global reputation. Yet the Saudis do not seem to be moving in that direction. They answered the calls for peace from Pompeo and Mattis, who have never called for peace. They're two war dogs, but they answered the call for peace from Pompeo and Mattis with more airstrikes. The Trump administration's November cessation of mid-air refueling of Saudi coalition flights does not seem to have changed Saudi calculations. Clearly, the U.S. needs other means to persuade them. So I think that's an example of a regional player, while very much tied to the U.S., also acting in what they see as their interest and the weakening grip that the U.S. once had. And I think it should also be noted that one of the main demands of the Saudi blockade on Qatar was the closing of Al Jazeera. And just as the Saudis failed to silence Al Jazeera, they failed to claim victory in Yemen, despite billions of dollars worth of the most deadly weaponry and technology. The sophisticated weapons and the active support of U.S. military helping to refuel their planes in midair against what appears to be a fairly ragtag army that operates in pickup trucks, and the Saudis can't defeat them. So I think it's, like their U.S. counterparts, they're capable of tremendous destruction and damage, but they seem to be not so capable of winning. So that's how I try to understand it through the bigger picture.
I want to, as we are talking about, from the international perspective, I want to kind of have the American, organizing and kind of American public perspective, and I'd like to give the mic to Isaac, since he's been, organizing local, state, and national organizations and entities to kind of bring attention to this crisis, and also been organizing with Somia as well, which will be coming in last to kind of talk about the real effect of what, we hear a lot of data and we hear a lot of numbers, but having someone, being in constant contact with people there kind of gives you a better idea about what's going on, and also from the American Yemeni, they're organizing for it.
Is it okay if I put this microphone back? Actually, I prefer no microphone if that's okay.
Perfect, actually, me too, that's great.
So I can't speak for all Americans, unfortunately. I wish I could. But I can speak for myself, and I can speak for Action Corps. And I also should confess that I'm not an expert on Yemen by any means. Who here has family that's from Yemen? And maybe someone could interpret for your grandma. Okay, you understand. Great. So you all are much more of experts on Yemen than I am. But I have spent my life here in the United States, and my family is from here, and I can say that I did not know where Yemen was 2 years ago. I really didn't. And what I find is in talking to fellow educated Americans, people are mostly as clueless as I was 2 years ago. And then when you have a war going on, we talk about truth being the first casualty. And so that just multiplies that. I mean, people have some sense of, there was a journalist, Khashoggi, who was murdered by Saudi Arabia. Some sense about that. And there's some humanitarian crisis going on in the Middle East, and yes, and there's something happening in Yemen. What's going on? That's sort of the impression, the questions that I get. Thanks to folks like Ben and other journalists, those of us who seek the information can get different perspectives and get more information. This gathering is talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, and we've been talking a lot about the darkness in the tunnel and what I believe is evil. I think it's just wrong what's happening. But I do want to talk about that light. if I may. When Action Corps, which we are all volunteers, I work in a community health center to make a living, but when we started working on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, I was told by multiple well-respected leaders in advocacy organizations in Washington, D.C., by staff members of influential members of Congress. I was told by them, we can do some things, but there's no way that we're going to pass legislation, or it would be very difficult, extremely difficult, and very unlikely, and it's not worth your time to try to question the constitutionality of the U.S. support for the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition in Yemen. But President Obama, without authority from Congress, in violation, I believe, of the U.S. Constitution, began support for the Saudi-led bombing 4 years ago. Congress, according to the U.S. Constitution, has the authority to declare war, not the president. But Congress has been too afraid to challenge the president, and for political reasons has chosen not to challenge the president on unconstitutional war since 1973, around the time of the Vietnam War. But what we saw in the last 2 weeks, Congress has finally passed a joint resolution, bicameral, meaning both the House and the Senate. It was a bipartisan bill, was passed, saying that this war must stop, and it will go to the president's desk in the coming days. This is a historic moment, and it sets a precedent not just in terms of Yemen, but for wars around the world. And this did not happen without the organizing of folks like sitting at this table, folks I see out here, young people, Somia, your children, your friends, your family, the community. The Yemeni-American community has been devastated by this war. And I see it when I talk to people where there's, and by the way, I should take a moment to say that the Houthi rebels are no angels here. Okay, and that it's important, I think, for us to talk about stopping the war and stopping the humanitarian crisis and where we can put leverage. And for those who are watching this who have relationships to the Houthi movement, I encourage you to urge your leaders to stop the war crimes and come to the table and to negotiate, because I believe that there's only a political settlement. That we this is not going to be won through war. And the United States can play a leadership role by removing its support for the Saudi coalition. And we have seen that with the war powers legislation, when we have had votes, it's not even the votes themselves, the outcomes of the votes, but just the fact that the House was going to vote, just the fact that the Senate was going to vote. When we saw those votes happening, that's when we saw the administration of the United States calling on Saudi Arabia to negotiate in good faith, saying you have to give something, you have to do something.
And when we can expand on it when it comes to the solutions and kind of reminding people that organizing is one of the main things that they can do. It's an everyday solution that is an easy something. If you feel you don't feel powerful, you feel like nothing matters. These are the things that matter, as Isaac said. But I wanted to kind of also give what you started with, kind of mentioning the American perception for the Yemen. Most of them don't know about it, or kind of know about it, or most of them, like you said, couldn't even put it in a map. And I think that the main thing that I want the audience and everyone watching to focus on is kind of like have an understanding of what the American, even whether they know or don't, what are the main thing that you've seen, either from organizers or from the state legislation or anything like that for you is the main challenge or the main kind of misconception that people have when talking about the war in Yemen?
Well, I would say that the first thing is that people everywhere, whether they are pro-intervention or whether they are anti-intervention or whether they're American or whether they're Yemeni, can agree that it's not acceptable to starve children, it's not acceptable to bomb hospitals, it's not acceptable to collectively punish people. And that's one thing that I really find wonderful, is that we can agree on these basics that are aligned with international law. And one of the things I'm not sure if this answers your question, but one of the things that's been helpful to me is that there are constitutional conservatives in the United States, people who usually I would agree on very little with, who are saying, you know what, this is an unconstitutional war, we need to uphold the Constitution. Libertarians who don't believe that we should be spending money on foreign wars. The priority is around the budget issues. Maybe not so much about maybe the humanitarian concern is secondary. But hey, if whatever our reason is for wanting to stop this war, let us come together and work together.
And speaking of that, that's a good segue for kind of talking with Somia, who's been organizing with Isaac and has been with other American Yemeni. I kind of wanted to have an idea about, we've been talking about data and numbers and, in general, and one of the biggest things that I think most people would agree with is that not having a human story of it, or kind of like matching it to what it means, 20,000 children dying, or people not being able to come to the US, not to see their families and vice versa. I think that the main issue for the lack of understanding or caring or even knowing of the Yemeni crisis is that because something is happening very far and they can't really get involved with it. So if you can talk about kind of your experience from back home and also your experience from American Yemeni here that have been organizing and kind of trying to explain the situation.
As a Yemeni-American who immigrated to United States in 2007, my family is still in Yemen, all my family. I only have my daughters, my husband and my mom are here, but like my sisters, my brothers, all of them are still in Yemen. So for me, when I speak about Yemen, I'm going to speak about it from my perspective, my experience, and my family experience. The situation in Yemen, my family in Sana'a. Sana'a is the capital of Yemen. So my family over there, honestly, they still, they didn't know exactly what is going to happen next. They didn't have hope. They didn't know exactly what they can do. They can't speak up because the situation now, Yemen is divided into different groups. If they're gonna speak, maybe the people are gonna count them as a Houthi supporter, and some if they're gonna speak with Abdurrahman Mansour, they're gonna count them as a Saudi supporter. So they can't speak up. They just have to work and to take care of what they're gonna do next, what they can do for their children. And even it's not safe inside Sana'a. And when they go outside in the street, it's not that safe. Because anytime Saudi Arabia, they're just gonna send their airplane and they're gonna bomb the street. If you heard about the last incident that happened a week ago, that Saudi Arabia bombed a place next to one of the schools and 10 of the children died while they are in schools. Their parents, they send their children to school to learn, and they know that their children are gonna die. This is really, it's impact all of us. When we hear that, how the parents feel when they send their children, they don't know if they're gonna see them anymore. They don't know if they're gonna see them anymore. They just send them and they say okay, what are we gonna do? We don't have any choice. Our hope, it's with the people who's living in the United States. This is what my family say. Our hope is on you, to try to advocate for us, advocate for all of us, because we cannot do anything. We cannot do another revolution. The revolution is destroy our country. This is what happened before. People, they did the revolution against Ali Abdullah Saleh because they want to make change and they want better life, but they figured out that was the worst decision that they made. Because our country, just the Saudi Arabia, because they don't want to do the revolution. Saudi Arabia, they have their own agenda. They want the oil. They don't want the Yemen to grow. Yemen, it's really rich country. But because they have their own agenda, they are not going to let this country grow. So this is kind of our problem. And also the biggest problem that we face that after the revolution, the Houthi control Sana'a, Abdurrahman Mansour, they just moved the bank, the central bank from Sana'a to Aden. And now the people in Yemen, they are working, especially in the north, they work so hard without salary. Do you understand when someone go to work without salary? Like they don't have even money to afford it for the transportation to go to their job. Because what? Because they care. Because like if they're gonna stop working, who's gonna teach their children? Like my sister, she's a teacher. I have two sisters over there. Both of them are like mathematics teachers. And they cannot stay home. They say like, if we're gonna stay home, who's gonna teach the children? So like our life is gonna stop, basically gonna stop. We don't have salary, but like we have to keep going. We have to keep the life going. The only hope that we have is the people who's like us, who's doing the work, who organize and work every single day. Our work is volunteering work. We don't get money for that. We just work so hard because we believe in our case. We believe that we can make that change. As we know, the power is two kinds of power. Power of money, which is Saudi Arabia has the money, and they control people by their money, and the power by organizing people who's like us. And we are trying to use this power, and thanks God, we have a great people who's around us, and who works so hard, like this hand. He's doing like amazing job. He's a plus for Yemeni people. I keep saying like, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do. When you organize all those people to go to do lobbying and things to stop the war in Yemen, that's really good stuff. I can't thank him enough. And also for the people who's like Larry and Penn, who's really speaking the truth and trying to advocate by like they are trying their best. Like those the allies for the people who's really care about our country, who's really care about our people. And like we are as an immigrant, Arab American, Yemeni-American who's living in this country, we are under two depression. The first depression is the war in our country, and the second one is the Muslim ban. We cannot bring our family here. This is the biggest problem also that we face. I have like my family, I can bring any one of them. Because what? Because of the Muslim ban. I have my sister who has a 4-year-old son who's American citizen, but she cannot come to here with her son because she doesn't have paperwork. She cannot enter this country. She cannot get visa because of that. This is my story.
I'll continue without the mics, so that you guys can do it. And that is exactly the perfect kind of segue to talk about what Saudi Arabia and the kind of the relationships between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. that not only escalated this, but started out that is far more complicated and far more longer in history. And I'd love to have Larry and Ben kind of take the lead on that. With Larry, you started out, and then have a discussion about your perspective of the U.S. and Saudi relations.
Okay. Well, as I was saying earlier, I mean, I see this mainly in a bigger picture and in terms of regional players trying to fill a vacuum that's been created by the weakening grip of imperialism, and especially U.S. imperialism, and the regional players, of course, being Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I think that this is underscored by the U.S. failure. 18 years at war in Afghanistan. 18 years. And there may be no end in sight. They're trying to find their way out now, but 18 years and 16 years in Iraq. And the war in Iraq has, turned the entire Middle East on fire and totally engulfed Syria and Libya. So there's tremendous destabilization, tremendous convulsions, social convulsions, and not just in the Middle East, but here we're focused on the Middle East. So I think, it's the struggle to control production, price, and flow of oil, like Somia referred to, and these regional powers are trying to show some independence from the major powers. At the same time that they rely on them. So now the U.S. Congress has voted to stop military support for the Saudi war. It did not cancel any of the weapons contracts. It did not say that there can't be any more weapons contracts. All it said was that U.S. military personnel can't be involved in this. And
I want to go back to your point about kind of like the struggle to control the production of oil and kind of, because we've seen this as a recurring theme in different crises that's happening throughout the Middle East. The same thing back in 2015 Iran, with Syria now, with Libya and any other country. We wanted to see kind of, if you guys can talk about these hidden objectives and agendas, not just controlling the oil, but also it goes beyond like economic, but also just like a power struggle to make sure that other powers and other foreign entities don't get control.
Absolutely, and like all wars, this is a war fought over economics, for geopolitics, and unfortunately it's human civilians who pay the cost of that. Really quickly though, I did want to jump off of what Somia said and just underscore the intense hypocrisy, the criminality of the fact that the US government, which has been responsible with Saudi Arabia, the US playing a leadership role in creating the worst humanitarian catastrophe in Earth inside Yemen, then under Trump is now banning people who are trying to flee the war the US has been funding for 4 years from coming to this country to seek refuge, even if they have family here. I mean, that is criminal. It is hypocritical. It's so sadistic. So we just underscoring that fact. As for the political reasons, certainly oil is a big part of this, and I largely agree with what he just said, although I think at the same time it's certainly true that the US political system is in crisis, US imperialism is in crisis, but Saudi Arabia is not acting independently. Saudi Arabia has never fought an external war without external support. Saudi Arabia is an extremely corrupt absolute monarchy ruled by a royal family that has very specific isolated interests, and they made a pact when Saudi Arabia was founded. I mean, this is the Arabian Peninsula. Saud, it comes from the family, Ibn Saud, Saudi Arabia is named after the royal family that entered a pact in the 1930s with the British Empire and subsequently the American Empire at the end of World War II. The deal was Saudi Arabia will give the US and Britain oil, and in return you will protect our monarchy from being overthrown. Which is why we've seen the overthrow of monarchies in virtually every other Arab country. Iraq had a monarchy, Libya had a monarchy, Syria had a monarchy, Saudi Arabia is still a monarchy. An absolute monarchy, not a constitutional monarchy. And so we can't understand this conflict without understanding that Saudi Arabia can only wage this war because it has support from the US and the UK. So that's a key point. Now the political aspects. Yemen it's true, it does have natural resources, and in that sense it's a rich country. It also is a rich country in the sense of thousands of years of history. This is one of the oldest continuously populated countries in the world. A lot of that history has been destroyed by the war. Saudi Arabia has been bombing very important historical sites in Sana'a, in the capital, and also in the north in Salata. Like areas, buildings that were thousands of years old that have been now reduced to rubble. Now, whether or not it's for oil, that's a more complex discussion. Yemen doesn't have significant oil reserves. But there's an important aspect of oil in the sense that Yemen is very important in its geopolitical strategic location. Yemen at the south end of the Arabian Peninsula, and especially what's called the Bab al-Mandab. And if you look at a lot of the fighting in Yemen, it has happened in the southwest of Yemen, near Hodeidah and Taiz, these two major cities, Taiz being the third biggest city in Yemen. And technically what was part of North Yemen, and I'll get to that in a second, because Yemen was divided until 1990, and I'll get to that in a moment. But a lot of the fighting has been in the southwest of the country, in the rebel-held areas, the Houthi-held areas, and it's not even necessarily about the politics in that location, it's about getting access to the Bab al-Mandab, the Mandab Strait, because every single day in this area, in the southwest tip of Yemen, there's a small strait that's quite small, kilometers long, it's not big, and that is controlled currently by the Houthi government, formerly in alliance with Salah, and every single day 3.8 million barrels of oil and other petroleum products go through this thin strait. So yes, unfortunately at the end of the day, that is a huge factor in this conflict, is simply geopolitics, trade, oil. But then there's also simply the political aspect. So when Yemen reunified in 1990, it had been, since the 1960s, North and South Yemen independently. Both of them leaned more toward the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And when Ali Abdullah Saleh became the leader and Yemen was unified in 1990, he moved towards Saudi Arabia with the collapse of the Soviet Union that had traditionally been the supporter of Yemen. And basically made a kind of deal where Saudi Arabia would continue to exercise influence in return for funding schools, mosques, madrasas, trade deals that were beneficial, that Yemen benefited from. And of course, in return for that, Saudi Arabia spread Wahhabism and simply turned Yemen into kind of like a soft colony where Saudi Arabia exercised more and more influence, especially in the south. So we can't understand this conflict without understanding the conflict. So as Somia said, the country has effectively been divided again. And the south is essentially a colony of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the UAE, in fact, took over the island of Socotra, which is a beautiful island with very unique vegetation that you can't find anywhere else in the world. The UAE took over the island with tanks. It's just colonialism. And of course, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are doing this with the support of the US and the UK. So we need to also understand it as a political conflict where the so-called southern government, I'll make a final comment here. The media reports on Yemen have frequently spoken of the government in the south as the internationally recognized government. Well, of course, what they don't mention is that the leader, as I mentioned, the ostensible leader of South Yemen, the internationally recognized government, Abu Mansur Hadi has been living in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, since the beginning of the war in 2015. He barely comes back into Yemen. He's been governing by fiat inside Saudi Arabia as Saudi Arabia bombs his country and his people. And in addition to that, we also have to understand that the South is not even the majority of the population. More than 60%, closer to 70% of the population is concentrated in the north. So Aden, the major city in the south, is under the control of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But this is an internal conflict that has really, kind of echoed the divisions we saw during the Cold War. So we have to understand it as a regional conflict. It is not a sectarian conflict. The media frequently will refer to the north, the Houthis and others, as Shia, and they'll say this is a Sunni Shia conflict. No, it's not really, and we can talk more about that. It's a political conflict, and also the Zaydis in the north, which makes up the majority of Muslims in the north of Yemen. Zaydi Muslims are actually very similar to Sunni. They're more similar to Hanafi, like the Hanafi madhab of Sunni Islam, than they are to the 12 or Shia Muslims. So again, just to underscore those points, that certainly oil and geopolitics is part of it, and this is a political conflict with Saudi Arabia trying to reassert control over Yemen, and unfortunately it's Yemeni civilians who are paying the price of that.
So I want to also go back to more of the political part of it, kind of like trying to understand or if you can try to explain the falling of U.S. imperialism, and I want to go back to Larry and then kind of like go back and forth, because kind of having control of this area has been the main thing for the international community, specifically for the U.S., for the U.K., and also for NATO, and also for Russia. I kind of want to have a conversation about how did the war in Yemen, the involvement of Saudi Arabia, was happening with Qatar and the Emirates, kind of how does that fit in with this power struggle between Iran and Russia, and between the U.S. and the European powers?
Well, I think if you look at the Middle East today and compare it to the Middle East on September 1st of 2001, it's totally different. And the U.S., arrogance and thinking that they could go into Iraq and, it's going to pay for itself, it'll be done in 6 weeks, and Bush on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished, and all of this has totally destabilized everything. And I don't think that means that we should strengthen U.S. imperialism for the stability. I think we should do whatever we can to defeat U.S. imperialism. But I think that was kind of a turning point. And So, and who was the big winner in Iraq? Let's say it was Iran. Iran, and who was the winner in Syria so far? If not Iran. Iran and Hezbollah are much stronger. The U.S. and its allies have taken a beating. And so I think that, I tend to view this somewhat as an extension of that whole process. And even though, you have to deal with all of the particulars and really try and understand it all, but I think it's, the Middle East right now is on fire. And, I think, the point about the hypocrisy of the travel ban and everything, I would just say that, there's different levels of people's consciousness when we talk about workers and students in the U.S., whatever. And while Yemen seems to be far away from many of them, when that travel ban was initially announced, thousands of people stormed airports all across the country to try and defeat that, very spontaneously. And also, there was the strike, I don't know if people are familiar with the strike of the bodega workers in Brooklyn, who are Yemeni bodega owners. All of the shops closed, and Borough Hall was surrounded by what appeared to be thousands of people. I didn't do a head count, but it was a lot. And they had a lot of support as well. So there's different levels, I think, of consciousness on this. And I think that, it's uneven, but there is a basis for thinking that you can build international solidarity. And certainly the fact that this war is dragging on, I think the U.S. is trying to cut its losses right now. That's why I think they passed this resolution, similar to Vietnam, in fact. Isaac was saying they haven't done this since Vietnam. Well, Vietnam, they were there for like 10 years, and then all of a sudden they decided on the War Powers Act when it was clear that they couldn't win. And I think it's a not exactly the same, but a similar situation taking place here. I don't know, if Trump is going to sign it. I don't know if he's going to veto it. I don't know, what the outcome of it is going to be. But
we can try to figure out kind of like a way to, in the solution, kind of talk about different ways to kind of make sure that these organizing impact, the Muslim ban, and there was the No Ban Act that was going to be introduced in Congress, and we can talk about that in the solution with Isaac and Somia and Larry. But I kind of wanted to also have Somia mention kind of the history or wasn't there like the animosity in history between Yemeni people and Saudi people, or Saudi governments, and then also.
Yeah, as you know, if we're going to go back to 1964 when the first revolution against Imam happened in Yemen, the Saudi Arabia were supporting Imam, which is the Imam, it was like his way how he controlled the Yemen. It was exactly the same. It was like kingdom, same of Saudi Arabia, and they were the first supporting against the revolution. They were giving a lot of money to Imam to stop this revolution. So after Yemen happened, it started being democratic country, and many presidents take over, Al-Hamdi and Al-Ghashmi, many presidents, and they get killed from Saudi Arabia, send people to kill them because of that, they don't want them to impact their country, because it's democratic country, it's their neighbor now, they are democratic, and they don't want them to grow and to learn and to be much better. And so this is from there, Ali Abdullah Saleh, when he took over, he started trying to have relationship with Saudi and be nice to them and try to to work with them as our neighbor, and you have to support us, we're gonna support you, and we're gonna do whatever you want so we can have good relationship. And Yemenis people, a lot of Yemenis people, many of my family used to go to Saudi Arabia and work there and live there, and also it wasn't that difficult. But Saudi Arabia had their own goal, as Mr. Ben said, they have the Wahhabism, they want to separate it in the country, and they start having the schools and paying a lot of money for we say mahad, ma'ahid. Like those ma'ahid, like it's like teaching the Salafi and like Wahhabi curriculum for people. From there, like our country, we saw our country has changed. Before we used to have like women, like my mom, she's here, like she used to wear hijab and like she never wear like the niqab or jilbab, like they changed it and we see the country has changed and now we start seeing like women wearing like the black dress. Before we didn't have that. That came from Saudi Arabia. If we're gonna go back to the history, it wasn't like this. And also people, they were very simple. There's this no division between like man section, women section. Wasn't like this. People, they were very simple. They talk to each other. There's like no problem. My mom, she can talk to to her neighbor and say hi, how are you? Like now, like people, like I don't know. This is like their curriculum. They teach our people, and that's what when our country starts to change and we start having Kulliyat al-Iman. Like lead by like Sheikh Zindani, if you know him, he's now in Saudi Arabia. It's like they funded that and they give people like salary to study their ilm, their deen, like and completely it's completely different than the Sunnah. Sunnah it's different than what they have been teaching people. That it's really more complicated, and that's how our country starts changing. When Ali Abdullah Saleh starts saying no to them. This is was the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ali Abdullah Saleh was like very nice to Saudi. He's doing his best to make them happy. But like when he starts saying no, I have to start like invest in my country. I want to start invest in my people. I want to see the women study in college. I want to say like he start empowering women. So when he started doing that, they didn't like it. They feel like, oh, no, now you have your own agenda. So they didn't like that. From there, it started like the conflicts started from this step. And that's why they started like having like another parties giving them money under the table. So those parties start like calling people to start something called the revolution against Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ali Abdullah Saleh, when the revolution started in 2011, he called all the people, come and I will change whatever you want. Like he said, I'm gonna change whatever you want. What is the things that you want me to change? Give me a chance. And the people, they said like, no, we want you just to resign. You have to resign and we're gonna make the change. But like he already know the agenda of our Saudi Arabia, and also he told them exactly what's happening now. He told them, this is what's gonna happen. They wanna divide the country to 4 countries, and this is what's gonna happen. Many like groups gonna take over, and you will keep fighting, and no one gonna win. And this is what is gonna happen exactly what he said. It's happening now, because he really he said like I worked with them many years, and I know exactly what they want from our country, and he knows exactly. He said like. Even the war that was in Saada against Houthi, they were supporting me, they gave me money for that. And I know inside myself that we will never win since we are getting support from Saudi Arabia. This is what he was saying. He knows that they have their own agenda. That's why he said like, I believe that I'm gonna win since I'm not gonna take any money from them. Because they always change the subject and they always do, they have like their own way how to control this country and like steal everything. As all of them, they said like our country, it has really important location. Everyone wanna control it. Bab al-Mandab, it's really important. And like if our country, like even before, if in Ali Abdullah Saleh time, he wasn't controlled by himself. Like still, Saudi Arabia like was there, United States was like all of them. Because we didn't have all this money coming into our country. It was always dividing for other people to make them silent and to do not fight our people and to kill our people. That's why when he starts saying, no, I want to invest in my country, this is what happens. The revolution starts.
That's actually brings up to also what I wanted to ask you about. What do you think the international kind of coverage in media has been in some ways, either changing the narrative, not in some ways, in many ways, changing the narrative, for example, I'm from Algeria, there's now protests happening, and there's little coverage whatsoever about what was happening before. There was, I think, 1 or 2 articles here and there from the US. The protests were very peaceful. The people were calling for something that, for democracy, for a change of corruption. There was no coverage, and then last Friday, when the first time that a protest turned violent because of the police and the military getting involved and throwing smoke, guns or to different protests, blocking the tunnels, throwing water jets at them, that was covered in the US and in the UK a lot for the first time. So I wanted to talk about to Larry and then Somia first, and then Larry, and then also Ben, kind of the opposition and kind of the struggle that you've had about actually having to report the truth.
Actually, I had this conversation with you before when you told me about the revolution. I told you we are so sick of revolution. Very well. Like, this is the thing. The revolution always in Arab countries start like peacefully, because people they don't want to kill each other. People, they love each other. They just want to live their life. They want to have like a really good quality of life. That's why they are doing that.
And they don't want to immigrate.
Exactly. They don't want to move from their country. Our people, they love their countries. Like, if you can ask my mom over there, she said, like, I want to go back to Yemen, even if there's war. Like, all our people, they love their country. And this is the reality. But this is the thing. Like, when you start the revolution peacefully, and no one gonna cover it, by the way, in the media, they just gonna cover when there's like the violence started and people can start killing each other. And it depends in their self-interest. If they are interested in that or not. And this is what happened in Yemen. Like when people, they started the revolution peacefully and everything was very well, and Ali Abdullah Saleh resigned and gave like Abdurrabbu Mansour like for 2 years to chill until they started doing the election, new election and things. But this is the thing, like certain groups, they're going to stop this revolution. And those groups are actually the same people who's running the country under this president. And basically you only just going to remove the president. You are not going to remove the people who's under. Yeah, so it's like, it's big issues. But the problem also with the media, if they are not, like as I said before, there's 2 kinds of power of money, and which is now those countries using their money to change the narrative as they want. It depends on them. Like, and you see like money of like channels, they just like want money. They rather to do, like they will do whatever you want if you're gonna pay them money. Like, it doesn't matter with them. They don't care about the revolution and what is gonna happen next. They only care about what is the person who's given money wants kind of story. So they will go to cover a story and change the narrative as they want.
Which actually I wanted to ask Larry about it from like your experience. Trying to unionize journalists. What is do you think the main struggle and the main opposition? And then we'll also have like national journalists. Recently his opinion, but also is having journalists form unions one way to kind of fight this continuous money, whether it's underpaid or also influence for you to change the narratives, or is it obviously far bigger than that? But what are the main kind of first steps that journalists can take?
I think yes to both.
And to so many more.
Right. Having unions that have international connections, especially in the media, is potentially a tremendous asset to people who are struggling. And in December I was in Sudan, actually as an observer for a meeting of the Federation of African Journalists. There were representatives of 31 African journalist unions in Khartoum, and it was a pretty impressive thing. People struggling with a lot of the things that journalists in the Middle East are facing. It's a very dangerous job, and censorship, shutting down media outlets, being locked up, being killed. And 1 week after that conference, the rebellion broke out in Sudan that is still going on, and recently led to the toppling of the main president, not his clique, but him. And people are still in the streets, similar to Algeria, and the IFJ World Congress is taking place in June in Tunis. And I think it's going to be like a tremendously significant event, given what people are facing all around the world. Journalism has become probably one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. And journalists are not just killed in a crossfire, they're killed for doing their jobs. They're killed for covering what's going on. And so it's a very significant time.
Thank you. 5 minutes to kind of explain your personal experience on trying to report the truth, and also the opposition that you've had from major outlets and also from the people kind of trying to navigate the whole conspiracy mindset of it.
Yeah, as I began saying, the corporate media reporting on Yemen has been almost uniformly egregious, just horrible. And again, it parallels in many ways the corporate media reporting on Israel-Palestine. Frequently, as we saw with the lead-up to the Iraq War, corporate media outlets just echo the U.S. government lying. Whether or not it's lies, as we saw with Iraqi supposed WMDs, we've seen many other lies on the war in Yemen, and kind of, maybe not just blatant lies, but kind of half-true, distorted narratives. So I'll go through a few of those narratives really quickly. The first narrative, as I mentioned, it's just important to stress this, because you'll hear it a lot, that this is a Sunni-Shia conflict, which is ridiculous, because as I mentioned, Zaidi Muslims in North Yemen, in fact, I have Zaidi friends who told me they didn't even consider themselves Shia until they started being referred to as Shia. And as I said, under fiqh, like Islamic jurisprudence, Zaidi Muslims are more similar to mainstream Sunni Muslims than they are to Iranian-style 12 or Shia Muslims. Because Zaidi, or the madhab that they follow, is very close to the Hanafi kind of mainstream Sunni school. So that's a ridiculous talking point. It's also ridiculous, as Siham pointed out, because the conflict, political alliances have changed geopolitically. So at first, Qatar was actually part of the conflict, an alliance with Saudi Arabia for the first 2 years. But then when the Trump administration worked with Saudi Arabia, Kushner and Trump worked out this idea of blockading Qatar for a variety of reasons that changed the political alliance, and then Qatar shifted the other side, and now Qatar and Turkey oppose the Saudi war in Yemen for other, not necessarily because they care so much about the Yemeni people, unfortunately, but for geopolitical reasons. So it was originally portrayed as all the Sunni nations against Yemen, but actually there's a split within the Sunni nations. So Turkey and Qatar are against the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So we have to understand these larger political alliances. So that's a ridiculous media talking point. The other ridiculous media talking point we'll hear a lot is that this is a Saudi-Iranian proxy conflict, which of course ignores the internal conflict going on, as we've been discussing. It's actually largely a north-south conflict in Yemen, and then international actors have been exacerbating that and further creating a de facto split, once again, between North and South Yemen. It's gotten back to before 1990, where effectively there are two different countries with two different governments. But Iran, it's a longer conversation to talk about the alliance in the north between Salah's forces. Salah is dead now, but between them and the Houthis. But they're not Iranian proxies. This is an internal Yemeni conflict. Iran's role has been very limited. The supposed reports on Iranian arms shipments have been exaggerated. There still is very little evidence of Iranian involvement. And Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is actively bombing on a daily basis with 20,000 air sorties. And Saudi Arabia is controlling the southern government, and the president of the southern government is living in Saudi Arabia. So there's a false disparity there between... So those are common narratives. And then the final most common narrative that we hear a lot is that the coalition is a Saudi-led coalition, which is true ostensibly on paper, but as we've been talking about, in reality, even though the media says it in every single report, they say Saudi-led coalition, Saudi-led coalition. But again, the United States government and the British governments have both been supporting Saudi Arabia and allowing it to carry out this war. So that's why I usually refer to it as the US-Saudi war in Yemen, because again, the war would end were it not for our government support.
So finally, we are actually going to address the point of the conference, which I'm going to go back to Isaac and to, is there a light at the end of the tunnel, which I agree with you, there is, and it starts, from bottom up. It's never, up to bottom. It's just if you wait for people or leaders to do that something on their own, the oppressor will never, on their own. So if you can talk about kind of your ideas about different legislations that have been passed or should pass that would help the crisis, but most importantly, how do we organize and how do we get it to that point?
Sure, thank you. I'm glad we get to talk about the light. So maybe somebody could interpret this into Arabic, but I believe that the light is not just at the end of the tunnel, but the light is within each of us. Would you be willing to say that or Somia? How would you say the light is not just at the end of the tunnel, but the light is also within us.
الضوء مش موجود يعني بس في نهاية النفق بس هو موجود بداخلنا احنا.
And so all we have to do is to let our light shine.
بس اللي احنا لازم نعمله احنا نخلي اللايت اللي بداخلنا الضوء انه هو يضوي.
The situation for Yemen is going to continue to be a struggle for years to come, even if the U.S. withdraws all support tomorrow. Right? But what we know is that by organizing together, we can make a tremendous difference. And I think that we have to believe that it is possible that there's light at the end of the tunnel. We don't actually have to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But we have to believe that it's possible that there could be light at the end of the tunnel someday. Because we have to have some possibility. And I think the fact that you're all here today is because there is some hope, even if the situation feels very dismal. And I will get more concrete.
Actually, before that, I'd love to have Somia translate it to her mom so that she can understand what you're saying.
I didn't understand what they said.
Do you want me to say it again?
يعني احنا هو بيقول انه احنا في معنا امل انه احنا ان شاء الله بنحقق السلام في اليمن، حتى لو هو الان بنشوف انه هو ما في امل والدنيا يعني مخربطه، بس اكيد حيكون في امل بان احنا نؤمن ببعضنا البعض بالاعمال اللي احنا بنعملها مع بعض. ان شاء الله.
So specifically, I want to give you an example of what some people here, because most of us live here in New York or New Jersey, and whether you're watching this live streamed in London or somewhere else in the world, you have power wherever you are, and even if you're living in Yemen and you're living under incredible oppression and fear, there is power that we have just in our interactions with one another. So a few of us decided that we had signed petitions and we had made phone calls and we had done vigils, and we needed to go to where the power was. And the power is, there is so much political power in New York and New Jersey. So who here lives in New Jersey, if you're willing to discuss? Thank you. So two of your senators are very influential on this stuff. One is Senator Menendez, Bob Menendez, who is I believe he's the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has a tremendous leadership power, and if we get in front of him and we can talk about Yemen, that's a good thing. And that's something that people in New Jersey Peace Action, Veterans for Peace, and Action Corps NYC have been, and other organizations have been organizing around that and have been doing that. You also have Senator Cory Booker, who's running for president. If you can get him to talk about Yemen, that's a good thing. If he talks about Yemen, then it's more likely the mainstream media will cover it. We went in front of Elliot Engel's office. He's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, just across the river in New York, in the Bronx is his office. And we showed up with a bunch of signs that said, I was making the signs that morning, I'm like, just a few signs and a few people. We went in front of his door at 8:30 in the morning before I went to work, and the sign said, Rep. Engel, stop fueling famine in Yemen. Because up until that point, he was absolutely silent about the responsibility of the United States and Saudi Arabia in the humanitarian crisis. Up until that point, he had said nothing publicly. I was told it was very unlikely that he would take a vocal stand challenging the U.S.-Saudi relationship. But guess what happened a few months later? His name went onto this legislation challenging that relationship, challenging U.S. involvement in the war. And he was on the House of Representatives floor speaking about this bill. And it was because of activists, in large part because of activists, just a few people showing up at the right time in the right place, willing to get up really early from Brooklyn and head up to the Bronx with their signs. If we use our power where we are, we can make a tremendous difference. And so specifically, opportunities for action. Those of you who are Yemeni or Yemeni-American, would you raise your hands again? So, your families have been damaged, have been hurt by Trump's policies. You could decide that you want to sue the president. Why not sue him for damages that you and your families have experienced? Why don't we get some lawyers who are willing to start a lawsuit? Even if you don't win a settlement or win a lawsuit, and even if you don't get a trial, the fact is that if you fight and you show that fight, we can get media attention to that. Maybe we invite Ben and maybe he'll write something about it or send out a tweet. But sometimes we have to use our power where we are. And think, the people in Washington, D.C., even the people who are big organizations that send out big emails, they don't have all the answers. Nobody's sitting in a room with a crystal ball and says, this is how we're going to end this war. The solutions could come from you or from you. It doesn't matter how old you are. It's important that we build relationships between communities. So I'm so excited to be in this Palestinian Community Center because the experiences of U.S. imperialism and of war, whether you're Syrian or Palestinian or you're Yemeni or you're Venezuelan or you're Iranian, all people have been impacted, and we need to build those bridges between our states and between communities. Finally, Somia was talking about the power of money and the power of people. And right now, people in New York are boycotting the New York Post for their racist portrayals of Representative Ilhan Omar. And this is something that is a great example of how we can take power just like that. And just like that, people can stop, working as a labor organizer. You understand this. That as workers, most of all of us are workers or students, that we have power. And there are various opportunities coming up. We talked about arms sales briefly. There's legislation around that that's coming up where we can mobilize around that. There are appropriations bills for the Defense Department and other bills that send money towards the military, and that there are opportunities for senators to object to this funding of the war.
Which is the increase of military budgets.
Exactly, and specifically address Yemen in those budgets and challenge us. But it requires people power. It requires us taking to the streets and taking to the halls of Congress.
I just want to give at least have 10 minutes for people to if they have any questions. But I want to kind of conclude this end this channel kind of solution with you, Larry. You've mentioned that you have no faith in Trump or the Crown Prince. Could you elaborate on that and then go from there?
Sure. I agree that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I just think it's a very long tunnel, and it's a very long struggle that we're involved in. And right now, I kind of view us as being in a dark night. But dark night will have its end. The sun will come up. I think that what I fear is that the contradictions that we're facing right now in the Middle East and around the world are leading us ultimately to a world war and another world war. And more of the world is at war. So there are like, it's like almost a world war in slow motion that's developing. And you remember a few months ago, the U.S. killed 200 Russian troops in Syria. And there are now Chinese troops in Afghanistan as the U.S. is trying to get out, and all throughout Africa. There are Russian troops on the ground in Venezuela, where the U.S. apparently had a failed coup attempt, but still has a possible invasion as an option. And there are Russian troops there now. So the confrontation between the major superpowers is, I think, more and more dangerous. But I just want to echo what Isaac said. I think that, at the very least, the bottom line is that in this very dangerous time, this very trying time, that we do what we can to build internationalism and international solidarity everywhere that we can. And, the demonstrations we were involved in against the prince, and when he was touring the U.S., when he came to New York, is an aspect of it. The forum we had at the Arab American Center is an aspect of it. My partner Susan teaches ESL at the Arab American Family Center, and most of the women are Yemeni, and she's come back and she's told me, a woman, showed a picture of the bombing of their neighborhood, and or one woman had to go back home because her husband couldn't get here because of the travel ban, or any number of things. But these little things help to build the kind of solidarity that's needed for the long haul. And our union is active right now on another front of building international solidarity, and that's at the U.S. southern border, where tens of thousands of refugees from Central America have walked from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador to the southern border seeking asylum. And Trump has tried to close the border and called out troops, and we have joined with thousands of other volunteers to create a welcoming community and help people seeking asylum. So I think that, I certainly can't predict the future, and we don't know what lies ahead, but what I do know is that the answer to all of these things lies in us and in our building of international solidarity across all borders.
And before I wanted to have Somia kind of end this, before we get into questions,
Yeah.
I also just want to say one thing, that I think that the main thing for all of these, the main thing to have discussions about these crises and everything that's happening is to put immigrants and nationals on the forefront to talk about it, because American-born, as an immigrant, and Somia as an immigrant, we've talked about this many times, is that as an American-born, it's very difficult to kind of understand the burden that you have from like not needing to immigrate anywhere for survival.
Correct.
Like, a lot of the immigrants that come here, the same people that are trying to come from the Muslim that can't come from the Muslim ban, or from not necessarily just a war zone, even stable countries. There's a reason. There's a particular thing happening for all of these immigrants to come here, and they wouldn't come here. We wouldn't need, open borders. We wouldn't need any borders if you had, an actual international community that supports each country. You wouldn't have any immigration problems. You wouldn't have Trump screaming "build the wall." If you actually created a situation and a community that helps the people, so that we can go back home, and so that we can actually survive, have jobs back home, and not need to come to anywhere and just visit and go back to just exchanging culture. And I wanted to have you talk about that a bit more.
I agree with you. Actually, there's nothing gonna happen if we are not gonna be together, united. And actually, while I'm here sitting at this event, I'm actually one of the organizers who organized the other event in Manhattan to boycott the New York Post. So that's why I'm keeping checking in people. Everything is good there. I'm trying to divide myself. Yeah. The things that what I believe that there is no winner. There is no winner in any war. We all loser. This is the thing. But I believe that there is a light in the end of this tunnel. But the light is not going to come up if we are not going to work together. And there is only two things that should be happening to stop the war in Yemen. One, which is like the power of United States. They have to vote themselves, which is this power. We cannot use it if we are not going to organize our people to demand them to stop the war. It's not only to stop giving weapons to Saudi Arabia, but to demand that we want them to find a political solution and to work it out with the coalition, the Saudi coalition. And when they're going to start this political solution, Saudi Arabia or anyone from the coalition, they shouldn't be involved in this political solution. And the political solution should be between the Yemeni people, and they have to sit in one table and to work it together. There is no winner. And this is what I believe, and all Yemeni people, they believe the same thing. And which is today, in Taz, people, they start doing some rallies and things. They say no, we are done with this. We're gonna be united. We're gonna be united. There is no Houthi, no Slahi, no Mu'tamari. All of us are gonna be together. This is really good to start it from Taz. And we want to see the other cities united together from inside, this is the best things that's happening now. It's gonna make our work here more easy.
Yeah, and I think just also one of the things that is a solution is to, like she said, to echo what she said, is to involve, hire, talk to immigrants, people from, not just for diversity, not just to have, pictures of people in your staff and having them, from different backgrounds. The point of diversity is that while she might not understand some, or I might not understand some of the American perspectives of not being born here, you're not going to understand our perspective as an immigrant. The only way to do that is to find the right people, ask questions. No one is born with all the answers, no one knows what is happening, and no one is expected to have an idea of all of what is happening and all of the different elements into a crisis. The only way to do that is to give immigrants and people of nationals of these crises a voice so that they can talk and they can advise on what the best course is.